Hello, welcome to the Literacy Knot. I am Cheryl Garner. We are brought to you today by our company, BrainSpring. I am here today with Esther Moreau, and she is going to be manning our chat. So we encourage you throughout the webinar, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. If they can be answered with a short answer, Esther will go ahead and answer you in the chat. If not, she'll break in and we'll have a discussion. So this is going to be a little bit less formal. So please feel free to ask questions, ask for clarification, and we will take care of that. A little bit about me. My name is Cheryl Garner, and I'm an instructor for BrainSpring. I was a teacher for 30 years, in most of it in Orlando, Florida, and then I finished up over in Tampa, Florida. So I am a teacher. I was a reading coach, curriculum specialist, kind of a little bit of jack of all trades, and I've taught every grade except for kindergarten and sixth. So wide variety of experiences and a lot of different things. I would also definitely qualify myself as the eternal student, a complete nerd. I watch webinars for fun. So I am that person. So welcome to our webinar. We've got some good stuff for you today. Several months ago, actually about a year ago, myself and Jen Pageant, we were asked to create a grammar program. So naturally, the very first thing we did, Jen is another instructor for BrainSpring, and what we did was we began to do research because we felt like anything we created needed to be based in research, had a good foundation in what the science of reading said. So we dove into several different books and quickly found Steve Graham as one of the leading experts for the science of grammar and writing. Quickly became apparent traditional grammar is just not effective. Just simply teaching grammar in isolation is not the way to go. And so Graham and Perrin in 2007 talked about how we need to teach the parts of speech, but it needs to be embedded in actual writing. So quickly this program morphed into a grammar and writing program. That was kind of the tip of the iceberg of our research because then we kept going and we read The Writing Revolution by Judith Hochman and Natalie Wexler, Writing Matters by Van Cleve, The Writing Rote by Joan Sedita, The Knowledge Gap, again, Natalie Wexler, and I won't say we read the whole thing, but we did read parts of that multisensory teaching, basic language skills. So many wonderful resources. And as we dug into all these resources, we watched webinars and listened to podcasts and read articles and seminars and basically kind of did an overdose on research. So as we looked at all of this huge body of research and the quantity of research for the science of reading and for writing is an insane amount of literature. And as we dug through, we found these 4 major reports. They were commissioned by the Carnegie Corporation and were actually used by the federal government. Writing to Read, Writing Next, and then the IES guides. IES is the Institute of Educational Sciences. These 4 guides really kind of talked about how reading and writing instruction should look. So we did some revision, and we quickly looked, and we said, you know what, this is kind of a misnomer we've been under. The science of reading is hugely popular and gaining momentum as it should. But it was a little bit of a misnomer, and quickly, actually my partner, Jen Pageant, said, you know what, it really isn't the science of reading. It really is the science of literacy. And all of those things point to literacy as an instructional practice, not just reading and not just writing. We came up the IES report and we looked at this science of literacy, and they talked about how we need to provide daily time for writing. We need to teach students to use the writing process for a variety of purposes and teach them to become fluent in handwriting, spelling, sentence construction, typing, word processing. This will help create an engaged body of writers. For 4th through 12th grade, slightly different, and you may actually recognize these in a lot of the educational practices we currently do for writing. We teach the writing process. Most schools, school districts teach writing as a process, as strategies. We have to teach kids to summarize text. Very often we expect kids to summarize text, but actually teaching them how to summarize text is a little bit different. We have to actually teach sentence combining to make those rich sentences, complex sentences, compound sentences, but most importantly, that we have to use writing for content learning. I remember way back in the 90s, early 2000s, there was a huge push for writing across the curriculum. And there was always talk about how to get, or that we had to get kids writing across the curriculum. We never really investigated how to make that happen. How do we get kids to write across the curriculum? And so that's an important piece. Not only do we need to use writing across the curriculum, we need to teach kids how to do that. Writing to Read came out in 2010, and we found out it is so important for kids to write about the text that they read. They need to do note-taking. They need to be taught how to take notes, not just expected to take notes. They need to ask and answer questions about text. That might sound a little familiar as our standard 1.1. So those are important strategies that we need instruction with. We have to teach kids writing skills and processes that go into creating text, but most of all, students must write. Now, in my school and in many schools that I've been in, many school districts I've been in, there is a definite literacy, a reading block, and then there is a separate writing block. And it's actually kind of a problem because, as Fitzgerald and Shanahan pointed out, reading and writing are deeply woven together, and they have unique qualities, but they're not identical skills, but they are so very closely related. They are the common processes, and the common sets of knowledge that we need for reading are also the common processes we need for writing. They overlap in the brain regions. And so if we can address instruction that is for reading and writing at the same time, we're actually looking at both parts of the brain. Now, the reading rope and the simple view of reading are important pieces. And so we know that the reading rope contains background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy. And these are the strategic parts of reading. So we know that if we are strategic in teaching those and that we concentrate on those areas as strategies, as standards, then our kids will be able to comprehend. But they also have to have word recognition to be automatic. And word recognition, of course, is phonological awareness, decoding, and sight words. Those pieces have to be automatic and happening in very, very short periods of time, 1/17 of a second, so that kids can focus on those higher level thinking. Of course, if either one of these pieces is missing, according to the simple view of reading, if we have no decoding is not fluent, or if the language comprehension is not in place, either one of those pieces, we do not have reading comprehension. We talk about phonological awareness for automaticity. Kids need to be able to process the sounds of our language. Phonics, direct instruction, multisensory, hopefully, instruction in how to decode words, how to decode multisyllable words, how to decode single-syllable words, which of course leads to sight vocabulary. If those pieces are automatic, our kids are going to be able to say the words. Saying the words is only half of the issue, though. We also need background knowledge. Kids have to have a wide variety of understanding so that they can make connections to text. We talk about background knowledge. Natalie Wexler, when we read The Knowledge Gap, was such a huge piece and so very important to me personally. Many, many times in our high poverty schools, we take kids out of the content areas, science and social studies, to do remedial reading. And so while we teach them how to decode the words, we're taking away this ever so valuable background knowledge. Our kids need this background knowledge. They need content. They need social studies and science content to be able to truly understand at a high level. Of course, vocabulary. I don't know any school that I've ever been in when vocabulary hasn't been an issue. Our kids need words. They need to be able to understand those words. They need to have meaning for those words at very different levels. Language structures, the structure of our language, how words are put together, the syntax, the semantics of our language, verbal reasoning, being able to identify and kind of define idioms and figurative language. And finally, literacy knowledge. How do words work? How do paragraphs work? What are the structures that go into communication? So all of these pieces, all of these reading analytics, we can teach kids the strategies for understanding text. And all of these pieces, we all agree, are extremely important. On the other hand, the not so simple view of writing. Writing is a really complex process because it requires a working memory. Our kids not only have to think of ideas, they have to hold them in the working memory long enough to communicate them on paper. They have to be able to compose. First, they have to be able to compose words, and then sentences, paragraphs, and essays. So that composition piece is rather complex. They have to be super automatic at things like spelling and encoding and sentence structure. Those things have to be automatic so that their brains can be freed up for the top part of the reading rope, that composition piece. And finally, we can't forget about that executive functioning piece, planning, motivation, organization. So writing is pretty complex. There's a lot of things that go into it. But if you look at the things that are involved in writing, there's a huge overlap with the things that we expect our kids to do in reading. This led us to this literacy knot. And so Jen and I looked at this huge body of evidence and we said, you know what? Reading is not in isolation. Writing is not in isolation. All of the evidence points to that reading and writing are extremely close processes, and they require the same kinds of skills. They require that kids are able to read about text and they're able to function and think about text, that they have background knowledge. And then they're able to use that same background knowledge to compose essays or even a paragraph. Okay, they have to have vocabulary to be able to express themselves. So we came up with the literacy knot of mirroring reading and writing, and they're tied together. You'll notice that on this literacy knot, you also see the strands of oral language and content area embedded and wrapped around everything, because oral language is kind of the foundation for everything. Our kids need to be able to speak and communicate ideas clearly, both on the front end during reading, but also in the summarizing after writing. They need to be embedded in content areas, because without those content areas, our kids are really going to struggle. I once read a statistic that 70% of all vocabulary after 4th grade is learned through content text. Clearly, we can't teach all the vocabulary our kids need to know. But if we can get them to read and read a wide variety of texts and really build that background knowledge, their vocabulary will follow. We know from the Writing Next that writing has enormous potential power. We know the best way to improve the syntax is not for me just to teach noun and verb, but actually to write it. So we know it reinforces our writing and our fluency skills, and it promotes the critical thinking. In fact, the best critical thinking about text is done through writing. It's a powerful lever to that knowledge. Joan Sedita in the Writing Rope, she talks about how we promote deep content thinking through writing. And we focus on the new information of ideas, but then we also make those connections. Somewhere in my repertoire of professional development that I've done over the years, we talk about connections to self, connections to the world, and connections to other text. All of those things should be embedded in writing. We need kids to explicitly think about those things when they read text, and then write about them. And writing in that content area, it moves information from the surface to a deeper level. Oral language is perhaps the overlooked piece. Oral language is at the heart of everything for literacy. It is what we need for kids to do when we're talking about basic sentence boundaries. We need for kids to be able to verbalize. Even my little kindergarten kiddos, they need to be able to verbalize those ideas, and they need to understand what is the sentence. I often remark to people that when we talk about sentences, my kindergartners, they will write a random string of letters, but it begins with a capital letter and ends with punctuation. The older kids get, the less that happens. And when asked, kids literally will say, I don't know where the sentence begins and ends. So if we can get at a very early level, building those sentence boundaries through oral language and continue it as they go along. Once they've written, then they should be able to speak on those topics, using that oral language to deepen and strengthen their own arguments and their own evidence. Fluency. Our oral language is a part of fluency. When we read text, we want kids to read with fluency. We want them to read with prosody, with expression, and that comes through oral language. A kid will have a very hard time pulling text and making that text fluent if they are not able to speak fluently. Of course, vocabulary. We want words not only in their receptive vocabulary, but their expressive vocabulary. When I teach vocabulary words or teach even content-specific words, I want to make sure that those words are expressive and my kids are able to use them in a conversation. Of course, phonemic awareness and phonics all depends upon the ability of speaking and listening. Okay, we talk about writing analytics. We know that background knowledge is important because through writing, students use the same background knowledge to create new pathways that they also use to understand. Okay. When we talk about vocabulary, daily exposure to academic and domain-specific vocabulary, when they use it as receptive language, but also expressive language.
Cheryl?
Yes.
I think it's a good time to kind of interject here. Brendan had a question relating to oral language, and I thought maybe we could deal with that right now since you just talked about that. Can you expand on how oral language directly ties to reading and writing?
Yeah, absolutely. When a student, I'll give a very basic example. In a kindergarten classroom, we're maybe reading Hop on Pop. And so as we're reading that story, I want kids to be able to verbalize, hey, what do you know? Who is this sentence or who is this page about? And, they say pop. And what do we know about pop? Pop is fat and such even a basic understanding. So I want kids to be able to understand and verbalize using that oral language of a complete sentence of pop is fat. Mm-hmm. And then when they go to turn that into writing, they understand the sentence boundary of who and what, which eventually will become subject and predicate. As kids get older, as they are in middle school and they are looking at much more complex texts, reading about ancient Mesopotamia, then I want them to be able to understand who are we talking about and summarize that text orally before they are able to move it to writing. Justification using oral language. I think about the Socratic method when we're asking why, and having kids continue to explain that why is exactly the prelude that we want kids to use for citing evidence in text as the older that they get. So that oral language really builds it. At IDA this summer, I was attending a conference or one of the sessions, and the professor is a professor, I believe, at the University of Greenwich in Connecticut. And he was talking about how also oral language is so important on the back end. And after kids write, having them not just read their writing, but actually talk about their writing. Talk about what did they communicate and why did they choose those things. So using that oral language on the front side, but also on the back side. You might notice our kids kind of struggle with oral skills. They are, they're so programmed rather than picking up a phone and talking to somebody. It's so much easier to text. And so we really want to build that oral language and that capacity to communicate through language. That
Perfect.
Gotcha. All right.
That's great. Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about, of course, background knowledge is extremely important. Okay, it's going to build a deeper level. It's going to help us make that connection between what we read and what we see. With vocabulary, exposure, using high-level vocabulary at every single level with children, building that understanding both of, tier 2 words, but also tier 3 words. Schema is going to be such an important piece for their understanding of vocabulary. Language structures, of course, in the writing revolution and writing matters. Students are liberally provided with daily practice with sentence construction, sentence combining. All of these pieces help kids to construct really, really good sentences. That kind of goes back to that oral language because I want kids to understand that the way we speak is not necessarily the way we write. And we want them to speak in a normal spoken language, but we want them to understand writing is a little bit more formal. And so we might need to combine some sentences to come up with complex sentences when we write for sentence variety. Our verbal reasoning, Steve Graham, Michael Hebert, they performed a meta-analysis of 100 different studies in which students wrote about text. What they found is that when kids write about text, they actually understand the text at a much higher level. So that's another reason why we want to teach these two things intertwined. And finally, with our literacy knowledge, we want to use cross-curricular mentor text when our kids are writing. If we're teaching kids how to grab their attention when we're writing fiction or an essay, when we want to model, we want to find great mentor texts where the author has done a wonderful job of beginnings. So we give kids some ideas of these are ways that authors, real authors, convey their thoughts. And of course, we want to deliberately teach that writing process. We want kids to understand that planning needs to precede everything when writing an essay or a paragraph or a thought, even if it's just bullet points and outlining. We want them to draft, and we want them to understand that revision is a part of the process. Nobody is a perfect writer the first time. And so our kids will draft, and then they will revise their ideas and take input from others in that revision process. And then, of course, the editing, the final cleaning up, so to speak. But we want to teach these processes individually. Writing automaticity, just like reading automaticity is important, writing automaticity is equally important because we want our kids to be able to communicate their ideas effectively. In order to use complex sentences and understand how the process happens, they have to have some things a little bit more automatic. They can't stop and think about how to form the letter H. They actually have to have that fluid. They need to be able to put those words together. Often think about cursive. Adults use cursive as a flowing sense of handwriting, and it's not a perfect set of handwriting, but it's meant to communicate. If our kids are so focused on how to form the letters, there's not going to get to that level of complex sentences or deeper thoughts or an analysis of text at which we want them to get to. We know that decoding and encoding face-to-face. So when we talk about speech-to-print programs or print-to-speech programs, the answer is yes. Kids need to do both. They need to be able to turn written text into speech, but they also need to be able to turn speech into print, and it needs to happen automatically. If there is a lot of thinking going into how to spell the words, kids are much less likely to use advanced vocabulary. And of course, sentence boundaries, which we were just talking about with that oral language. Kids need to understand those conventions of language, and it needs to be so automatic that they're not struggling to communicate those ideas. Now, what researchers tell us about handwriting, and I have to stop, take a little pause here and give a shout out to Denise Sherman because she has become my guru for handwriting. She has done so much research, and so if I have any questions, I go to Denise, and so this is all for her. So what researchers tell us about handwriting is that manuscript and cursive are a vital component. In many, many places, the preferred instruction for students with dyslexia is actually cursive handwriting. And so because cursive is less likely to cause the reversals that we often see in print. We need deliberate instruction in handwriting. Again, a piece that sometimes falls off of those state standards, kind of making a comeback. But our cursive handwriting, our manuscript handwriting, we need our kids to become very, very deliberate with those and also very legible with those. Often that legibility piece is getting lost. Handwriting fits in because it requires a combination of those cognitive skills, but good, comfortable, legible handwriting is a precursor for any writing task, or every writing task, I actually should say, including that's outlined in our state standards. Students who struggle with handwriting do not have the necessary processing space to develop ideas, choose their accurate spellings, or generate sentences and paragraphs. So we really need to work on that handwriting because that's that automaticity piece which frees up their brain to think about those more sophisticated concepts. Okay. In a quick summary, we know the science of literacy shows that reading and writing employ very similar skills, unique aspects of those skills, but still pretty much the same skills, which also tells us that reading and writing should be taught together. Speech to print and print to speech. We want to teach the process of writing, teach the process of handwriting, and have students write deliberately and often and about text because we want that oral language, we want those content areas to be primary. We look at the literacy knot It's on our website. You can check out the Literacy Knot and see all of the things that we have going on with that. And so you can check those out. And we are also on social media. So if you are interested in learning more about the Literacy Knot or the science of literacy, we are on all social media. You can follow us on Facebook, the Brain Spring Educator Academy. Our blog is OrtonGillinghamWeekly.com. Got some good stuff going on there. We also, and I don't have it on here, we have a wonderful podcast that happens on the regular. And so definitely check out our podcast. We are on YouTube, Pinterest, the Twitter, which is no longer Twitter, which is now X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So check us out on any of our social media sites.
Cheryl, we have a couple questions here.
Excellent. Let's go.
One question here. You mentioned earlier about note-taking.
Yes.
How do you explicitly teach note-taking?
So,
and by the way, thanks so much for this webinar.
Oh, thank you. So when I'm teaching note taking, I tend to really like 2-column or 3-column notes myself. 2-column notes allow my kids to summarize in a very concise manner. On one side, I do main ideas or big ideas, and then on the other side, I teach my kids to do bullet points of significant facts and details.
Okay, great. Here's another one. What's a good example of combining reading and writing in the same lesson?
Oh, okay. Oh, good. I'll kind of maybe like at a first grade level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So a first grade level, I would choose a content area text. So in first grade, maybe my student is reading about the state. And since I'm from the state of Florida, we're going to do the state of Florida. And so maybe my students are reading about the state of Florida. And we're reading about Florida. We're reading about how Florida was, founded in 1823. And, we were brought in by, it was founded by the Spanish. And so as they're reading this nonfiction text about Florida, I want to pause and I want to use that oral language. And I want my kids to, after reading a page or a paragraph, I want to stop and I want to have my kids verbalize. Who were we talking about on this page? And I want them to verbalize the Spanish or the settlers. And then I want them to verbalize what were they telling us about those settlers? And they may tell us the Spanish settled St. Augustine in 14 something. And that fact kind of escapes me. But I would then turn that into a sentence, and then that sentence would become my main idea. And so I would take that verbalized sentence that was basically a summary of the text and turn it into a written sentence. Talk to my kids. Well, okay, so where did they go and why did they come and how did they come, and use those asking and answering questions about text, and then turn those into statements, which then creates a very cohesive paragraph.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl.
Absolutely. Any more questions?
I don't see any more questions at this point.
All right. Well, we truly appreciate you coming. You can check us out on social media. This webinar will be saved on YouTube. So at any time you want to share it with your friends or your colleagues, we invite you to do that. And we invite you to come back and check us out in our podcasts and on our social media. Thank you so much for coming.